If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the United States of America. That was Donald Trump on Saturday morning, threatening to destroy the entire Canadian economy over a trade agreement he had praised just 1 week earlier. Not a strategic policy shift, pure panic. Because Mark Carney just did exactly what Trump claims to want. Negotiated a bilateral trade deal that benefits Canadian farmers and businesses, and Trump realized it makes Canada less dependent on American markets. The whiplash is extraordinary. On January 16th, when Carney announced the China deal after meeting with President Xi Jinping in Beijing, Trump told reporters at the White House that it was a good thing. Quote, "That's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that." 8 days later, after Carney delivered a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos that received a standing ovation and international praise, Trump completely reversed position. Now, the same deal is suddenly evidence that Canada wants to become a drop-off port for Chinese goods flooding into the United States. Now China will eat Canada alive and destroy Canadian businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. What changed in 8 days? Carney stood on the world stage in Davos and told the assembled global elite that the American-led international order is over. That middle powers like Canada must build strategic autonomy because great powers are using tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. He didn't name Trump directly. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. And Trump, who spoke the next day in Davos, responded with exactly the kind of rhetoric Carney had warned against. Canada lives because of the United States. Canada gets freebies. Canada should be grateful. Remember that, Mark, before you make your statements. Today we're showing you how a trade deal Trump initially supported became a 100% tariff threat. The moment Carney stopped pretending to be subordinate, how Trump's panic reveals exactly what he fears most: Canadian economic independence. And how the China deal that was supposed to be smart diplomacy became a weapon the instant Carney refused to bow. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's be clear about what Carney actually negotiated in Beijing. This wasn't Canada becoming a Chinese satellite state. This was a targeted trade agreement addressing specific irritants that had been hurting Canadian farmers for over a year. In 2024, the Trudeau government imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, mirroring what the United States and European Union were doing. Canada was following American leadership on China policy, being a good ally, coordinating with Washington on trade restrictions. China retaliated in March 2025 with 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil, peas, and other agricultural products. 25% tariffs on pork and seafood, including lobster. Then, in August, they added canola seed at nearly 76% combined tariffs. The anti-dumping investigation was set to wrap up in March 2026, potentially making the tariffs permanent. Canadian farmers were getting destroyed. Saskatchewan alone produces over half of Canada's canola. China had been a $4 billion market for canola seed. Without Chinese buyers, total canola exports fell by more than 2 million tons. Pork exports collapsed. Lobster and crab fishermen in Atlantic Canada watched their markets disappear. Carney went to Beijing and negotiated relief. Canada will allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the market annually at a 6.1% tariff, down from 100%. That's roughly the number China was already exporting to Canada in 2023 before the tariffs hit, less than 3% of the Canadian domestic auto market. In exchange, China drops canola seed tariffs to approximately 15% by March 1st. Canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas no longer face anti-discrimination tariffs from March through at least the end of 2026. Nearly $3 billion in export orders unlocked for Canadian producers. This is basic trade diplomacy. Canada had tariffs hurting Chinese EV makers. China had tariffs hurting Canadian farmers. Both sides negotiated a compromise that addresses their respective industries' concerns. Carney called it enormous progress. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, who traveled to Beijing with Carney, called it very good news for Canada and Saskatchewan. Trump's initial reaction? That's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. Then Carney went to Davos. On January 20th, Carney delivered an address at the World Economic Forum that will be studied for years as the moment Canada publicly broke with American hegemony. The speech was titled "Principled and Pragmatic: Canada's Path." The substance was a declaration that the rules-based international order is over and middle powers must chart their own course. Carney started blunt. "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics exposed the risks of extreme global integration. But recently, great powers began using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited." He didn't say the United States. He didn't say Donald Trump. But when you're standing in Davos talking about great powers weaponizing tariffs, while Trump is literally threatening to impose tariffs on NATO allies unless they support his Greenland annexation plans, the audience knows exactly what you mean. Carney warned that the multilateral institutions middle powers relied on, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the international climate conferences, are under threat. Countries are concluding they must develop strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, finance, and supply chains. Then came the line that resonated globally. Middle powers must act together, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. He laid out Canada's response: building strength at home, engaging broadly and strategically with open eyes, taking the world as it is, not waiting for a world Canada wishes to be. Prioritizing relationships based on shared values, while being pragmatic about diverging interests, no longer relying just on the strength of values, but also on the value of strength. The speech received a standing ovation, unusual for the World Economic Forum. Global leaders praised it. French President Emmanuel Macron echoed similar themes about Europe needing independence from American economic coercion. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen talked about building a new independent Europe. Trump, who spoke the next day, was visibly angry. "Canada should be grateful to us. Canada gets a lot of freebies from the United States." He didn't specify what freebies. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, before you make your statements. Carney responded calmly but firmly. Canada and the United States have built a remarkable partnership in the economy, in security, and in rich cultural exchange. But Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. We are masters in our own house. This is our country. This is our future. The choice is ours. That's when Trump's entire posture toward the China deal shifted. On January 16th, Trump praised Carney's China deal. By January 24th, after the Davos speeches and Carney's refusal to play subordinate, Trump was threatening economic annihilation. The threat came via Truth Social Saturday morning. Trump called Carney Governor Carney instead of Prime Minister, the same mocking nickname he used for Justin Trudeau when suggesting Canada become the 51st state. He said Carney was sorely mistaken if he thought Canada could become a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States. China will eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the United States of America. This is extraordinary for multiple reasons. First, Canada already made a deal with China. It's done, announced, in effect starting March 1st. Trump praised it a week ago. Now he's threatening retroactive punishment for something he previously supported. Second, the deal has nothing to do with Chinese goods flooding into the United States. The 49,000 EVs allowed into Canada at reduced tariffs are for the Canadian market. They're not being re-exported to America. Canada isn't becoming a transshipment hub. The entire premise of Trump's threat is nonsense. Third, 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods means economic catastrophe for both countries. Canada exported $352 billion in goods to the United States in 2024. American companies imported those goods because they needed them. Lumber for construction, aluminum and steel for manufacturing, oil and natural gas for energy, automotive parts for vehicle production. Doubling the price overnight would devastate American industries and consumers. Fourth, it would violate the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade deal Trump himself negotiated and signed. The agreement specifically prevents exactly this kind of arbitrary tariff imposition. Trump would be breaking his own signature achievement from his first term. But none of that matters, because the threat isn't actually about Chinese goods or trade policy. It's about Carney refusing to be subordinate. It's about Canada building relationships that reduce dependence on American markets. It's about a middle power demonstrating that American leverage isn't absolute. Trump's panic reveals exactly what he's afraid of. For decades, Canada routed the vast majority of its trade through the United States because alternatives didn't exist or weren't economically viable. 75% of Canadian exports go to America. Canadian businesses plan around American demand. Canadian supply chains integrate with American production. That dependence gave Washington enormous leverage. Threatened tariffs and Canadian governments would scramble to negotiate. Demand policy changes, and Canada would consider it seriously because access to American markets was existential. Carney is systematically dismantling that leverage. The China deal is just one piece. He's also negotiated new partnerships with Qatar on liquefied natural gas. He's strengthening ties with the European Union on trade and critical minerals. He's exploring deeper relationships with India after years of diplomatic strain under Trudeau. He's building the Churchill Port and Hudson Bay Railway to ship Canadian resources to Europe without touching American infrastructure. Every partnership that diversifies Canadian trade is leverage Trump loses. Every alternative market Canadian businesses develop is pressure Washington can't apply. Every supply chain that bypasses American territory is economic independence Trump can't tolerate. The Davos speech made this explicit. Carney wasn't just talking about China or Europe, he was announcing a comprehensive strategy of strategic autonomy, build strength at home, diversify partnerships globally, reduce vulnerability to coercion from any single power, including and especially the United States. Trump initially praised the China deal because he thought it was just bilateral negotiation, two countries solving trade irritants, no big deal. Then Carney stood in Davos and explained it was part of a broader strategy to make Canada less dependent on America. Suddenly, the same deal became an existential threat. Ontario Premier Doug Ford criticized the EV tariff reduction, warning it could hurt Canada's auto sector concentrated in his province. He called Chinese EVs spy cars and said the deal would tick off the Americans. He was right about the last part, but not for the reasons he thought. Trump isn't mad about Chinese electric vehicles. He's mad that Canada negotiated with China independently, demonstrated that Canadian interests don't automatically align with American demands, and showed other middle powers that alternatives to American economic dominance exist. Trump also revoked Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace the same day he threatened tariffs. The board costs $1 billion to join and supposedly oversees peace processes. Carney had expressed cautious interest. After the Davos speech, Trump withdrew the invitation. Not over policy, over a speech he didn't like. This is Trump's pattern. Loyalty is the only currency. Disagree publicly, and you're out. The invitation withdrawal was meant as punishment. Instead, it proved everything Carney said in Davos was correct. Trump's threat is probably unenforceable. 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods would require congressional approval for permanent implementation. It would devastate American industries. It would violate the USMCA agreement Canada and Mexico could challenge through dispute resolution. It would unite American business lobbies, Canadian provincial governments, and international trade organizations against Washington. But the threat itself does damage. Canadian businesses planning investments must now consider whether American market access is reliable. Companies looking at expanding production in Canada have to factor in the risk that Trump could arbitrarily double their export costs. The uncertainty alone discourages economic activity. Carney's response will likely be measured. Canada won't retaliate immediately. Ottawa will continue implementing the China deal because the benefits for Canadian farmers are real and immediate. Carney will keep building alternative partnerships because reducing dependence on American markets is now obviously necessary, not just strategically wise. Other middle powers are watching closely. If Canada can negotiate with China despite American objections, if Carney can give speeches criticizing great power coercion without facing actual economic annihilation, if strategic autonomy is achievable rather than theoretical, then other countries might follow. That's what Trump fears most. Not Canadian electric vehicle imports, not China using Canada as a drop-off port. The possibility that American economic dominance is optional, that middle powers can chart their own courses, that threats and coercion eventually backfire when pushed too far. Trump thought demanding subordination would force compliance. Instead, he's triggering exactly the kind of strategic autonomy Carney described in Davos. Every threat makes alternatives more attractive. Every insult makes independence more appealing. Every arbitrary tariff announcement proves that American reliability is gone. Let's return to the central absurdity. On January 16th, Trump said Carney signing a trade deal with China was a good thing. By January 24th, the exact same deal warranted 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods. Nothing about the deal changed. The terms Carney announced in Beijing are the terms being implemented. 49,000 Chinese EVs at reduced tariffs. Chinese tariff relief on canola, lobster, crab, peas. Benefits for Canadian agriculture, costs for Canadian auto sector, net positive for Canadian economy overall. What changed was Carney's willingness to publicly articulate why the deal mattered, not just as bilateral trade. As part of Canada building the partnerships and strategic autonomy necessary to withstand economic coercion from great powers who use integration as subordination, Trump praised the deal when he thought it was Canada being transactional. Negotiate with whoever offers the best terms, fine, as long as Canada still ultimately defers to American leadership. The moment Carney made clear the deal represented Canadian independence rather than just tactical bargaining, Trump panicked. The 100% tariff threat is Trump admitting Carney is right. If American leverage depended on Canadian dependence, and Canada is actively reducing that dependence, then Trump's only response is escalation. Threaten complete economic severance, hope the threat alone forces Canadian submission. But Carney already addressed this in Davos. Middle powers must develop the ability to withstand pressure. Sovereignty that was once grounded in rules will increasingly be anchored in the capacity to resist coercion. The question isn't whether to adapt to great power rivalry, but whether middle powers build higher walls or create genuine cooperation among themselves. Canada is choosing cooperation. With China on agriculture and EVs. With Europe on critical minerals and energy. With Qatar on LNG. With Denmark on Arctic security. With other middle powers who recognize that American reliability under Trump is gone and alternatives must be built. Every partnership makes Trump's threats less effective. Every alternative market reduces American leverage. Every demonstration that Canada can thrive without American permission undermines the subordination Trump demands. The China deal was always going to benefit Canadian farmers. That's why Trump initially praised it. But after Davos, after Carney's speech made clear this was about strategic autonomy rather than just trade, the deal became evidence that Canada is escaping American control. And Trump, faced with a middle power refusing to stay on the menu, threatened to burn down the entire relationship rather than accept that leverage has limits and coercion eventually fails. That's not strength, that's panic. And the 100% tariff threat proves everything Carney said in Davos was exactly right.